Medical often have unpredictable effects on the human body, which is why they should only be taken as prescribed by a doctor. But was the effect of the medication the reason for the horrific incident that occurred with the main character of this story, or did he knowingly commit a crime while using a convenient excuse? On the morning of August 27, 2015, a surveillance camera installed on one of the houses in the elite Mirabella neighborhood in St. Augustine, Florida, recorded a group of people talking animatedly about something, and then suddenly rushing in all directions as if they had seen something terrible. A few hours earlier, Amanda Colley, a 36-year-old mother of two, drove up to her house in a white SUV. Her marriage to her ex-husband had broken up about 6 months ago, and now the woman was building a relationship with a new partner. She had spent the previous night at his place, while the children were staying with relatives. Returning home, Amanda found herself in utter chaos. Someone had been there in her absence. The rooms were in complete disarray, drawers pulled out, things scattered on the floor, trash cans overturned. Some of the items were damaged. Shards of broken glass and ruined belongings were strewn everywhere. The frightened Amanda understood what might have happened. Her smartphone had a lot of missed calls and messages that she didn't want to answer, but it seemed there was no choice. Around 5:30 a.m., the woman called her current boyfriend, with whom they once worked together. Confused and not knowing what to do next, given the intrusion into her home, she asked him for help. Lomar DePerley, Amanda's new lover, immediately headed to her place in his pickup truck. About an hour later, the police headed in a similar direction. The officer, who was sent by the sheriff's department to respond to the call, had to assess the seriousness of the situation. Despite the fact that the call was not considered urgent, it was necessary to talk to the victim and examine the ransacked property. Amanda decided to refrain from filing an official intrusion report for now, preferring to consult with her divorce attorney first. The officer, after inspecting the scene and not receiving any official complaints from the woman, left her house around 9 a.m. Within the next few minutes, Amanda's friends arrived to support her during this difficult time. The first to arrive was Lindy Dobbins, a 39-year-old mother of two and the victim's closest friend. Having asked for permission from her bosses, she rushed to her friend's side in the morning to be there for her. Lindy was always ready to help in a difficult moment, regardless of her own inconvenience. A little later, they were joined by another mutual friend, Rachel Hendricks. After taking the children to school, she decided to support Amanda, as she had no other urgent matters to attend to. The three friends and Lomar gathered in the house, examining the aftermath of the rampage and discussing the incident, pondering their next steps. The shocked Amanda wept bitterly, not knowing what to do. However, she understood that before accusing her ex-husband, it was worth consulting with a lawyer. The woman had no doubt that it was he who had done it. Suddenly, the ex-husband called again, and this time Amanda decided to answer. The conversation lasted 14 minutes. The company was just in the living room when suddenly there were loud bangs and the sound of breaking glass. A few minutes later, a police officer stopped Lomar on the street as he was rushing away from his lover's house, not paying attention to the road. The man said that shooting had just started there. He had left the living room, gone down to the laundry room, and escaped through the garage, the door of which was half open. According to Lomar, the shooting at Amanda's house happened out of the blue. He suggested that the shots were fired from outside, but he didn't see for sure if the bullets hit any of those present. The man could not give the police any specific answers, but he was convinced that the attacker was aiming at him, so he hoped that the women in the house had survived. Unfortunately, the situation was extremely serious. A few minutes after Lomar left the house, the women who remained inside also tried to escape. Rachel managed to run out through the shattered front door. Noticing that the house of the neighbors, the Dickens family, was unlocked, she ran inside and hid in the closet. Then the woman called 911. She reported that she had managed to escape, was wounded in the arm, and suggested that an armed attack had been made on her friend's house. Rachel had an idea of who might be behind the attack and understood how dangerous he was. Therefore, she instinctively fled as soon as Lomar commanded her to hide. The frightening thing was that the shots did not stop while the 911 dispatcher was talking to Rachel. The woman was worried about her friends who remained in Amanda's house and begged the officers to come and help as soon as possible. Within the next few minutes, 2 more calls came to the police station, one from Amanda and the other from Lindy. Both women were just screaming into the phone but not saying anything. Gunshots could be heard in the background. Of course, the police responded to the call immediately. Arriving at the address, they saw a bloody massacre. Amanda Colley had suffered 9 gunshot wounds, most of them to her arms and legs. It appeared that the woman had desperately tried to protect herself from the bullets, but to no avail. The attacker had apparently emptied an entire magazine into her, seeking to leave the victim no chance of survival. Lindy was found at the end of a long hallway, in a pool of blood on the floor near the bathroom. She had apparently also tried to escape but didn't make it. She was shot in the back. The woman had received 3 bullets, which also proved fatal. Rachel said that moments before the shooting started, she noticed a male figure in the backyard of the house, emerging from the bushes on the winding garden paths. The next second, the stranger pulled out a weapon and opened fire through the glass doors, behind which the whole company had gathered. Because the glass heavily distorted the shooter's silhouette, Rachel was unable to get a good look at him. After analyzing the location of the bullet holes and the spent cartridges, the police confirmed the woman's testimony. Several unused 9mm cartridges were found on the path in the backyard. Lomar also corroborated her words. As soon as the police arrived, the man immediately returned to his lover's house. Although the situation was under the control of law enforcement, he realized that he and Rachel were still in danger. The criminal could return at any moment. According to Lomar, he also heard shots coming from the backyard. The man had no doubt that he was the target of the attacker, so he immediately fled himself and ordered the others to hide. Although he did not have time to get a good look at the attacker, he could name only one person who wished them dead. Rachel was convinced that the shooter was Amanda's ex-husband, James Colley, who had spoken to her on the phone shortly before the attack. According to Rachel, she and Lindy did not react as quickly as Lomar, so they hid in the pantry while Amanda apparently locked herself in the bathroom on the other side of the door. A few seconds later, Rachel heard a sharp sound. The front door slammed. Obviously, the attacker had entered the house. Approaching the pantry, he tried to open the door but noticed that it was being held from the inside. Then the man asked the women where Amanda's lover was hiding. The friends replied that he was not in the house, continuing to hold the door. After that, a shot rang out. The bullet passed through the wood and hit Rachel in the arm. The woman's grip weakened. The next bullet hit Lindy in the leg, and she screamed in pain. The wounded but still alive Amanda could be heard screaming from the direction of the bathroom. Taking advantage of a momentary opportunity, Rachel jumped up and ran out of the house, which had become a fatal trap. It seemed that the attacker fired several shots after her, but miraculously none of the bullets hit her. This was followed by a new series of shots, but Rachel no longer saw who became their victim and did not know what was happening in the house further on. However, by his voice, she recognized the shooter. It was James Colley, Amanda's ex-husband. A few minutes later, James' father called the police, reporting that his son had just confessed to him that he had killed his wife and her friend. But by that time, the police were already at the house. The bloody crime had been committed, and the killer had fled the scene. Law enforcement rushed to search for the dangerous criminal. K9 units were involved in the operation and managed to trace the man's trail to the next street. A discarded cell phone, presumably belonging to James, was also found there. Unfortunately, the car in which he had driven away could not be found. Given the time that had passed, he had long since left the area and could be anywhere. In addition to search dogs, the area was surveyed from the air using helicopters, but no clues were found. Several hours passed, and despite a thorough search, there were no results. An armed and extremely dangerous killer remained at large. Fortunately, that same evening, police stopped James Colley, who was driving his sister's car. Judging by the direction of travel, he was clearly heading out of state. The man's suspiciously nervous behavior prompted a search of the vehicle, during which a rifle and 2 pistols, 9mm and .45 caliber, were found. The weapons were lying on the passenger seat along with numerous rounds of ammunition. Later, a comparative analysis confirmed that the rounds found in the car were identical to the casings found at the scene of the tragedy and those removed from the bodies of the deceased. From the very beginning of the investigation, James refused to cooperate with the investigators, asserting that he did not remember anything about the events of that day. At the time of the horrific crime, in August 2015, the Colleys had been married for over 8 years and had 2 children together. However, in the spring, serious problems began in their relationship, which led to the forced separation. James moved to a city 20 kilometers from the family home and settled in with his sister. Amanda stayed with the children in their former residence. The following months, the couple spent in an exhausting divorce process, resolving issues of property division and child custody. Both sought to start a new life. James began dating his colleague Emmy, and Amanda entered into a relationship with Lomar, who worked with her at a sporting goods company. Despite the official dissolution of the marriage, James apparently continued to treat his ex-wife as his property. Suspecting that Amanda was seeing another man, he repeatedly called her, demanding to know who she was having an affair with. Fearing James' violent reaction, the woman decided to hide the truth from him. Learning about his ex-wife's new relationship, James became irritable and aggressive. His phone calls to Amanda turned into obsessive stalking, and eventually, she was forced to obtain a court order to protect herself. A few days before this, James had signed a sworn statement about the absence of weapons in his possession, which was one of the conditions of the restraining order. It later became known that on the weekend before the attack, Mike Dickens, a close friend of James and Amanda's neighbor, photographed a half-naked man mowing the lawn in front of the house where the Colleys had previously lived. This man turned out to be Lomar DePerley, Amanda's new lover. Upon receiving the photo, James again tried to contact his ex-wife, demanding an explanation of who she was dating. She continued to remain silent, assuring that the man was only a gardener. But Mike believed that a gardener would hardly work in such an appearance, because there was clearly more than a business relationship between him and the owner of the house. The jealous man received confirmation of his ex-wife's new relationship and, it seems, decided to act. Early in the morning of August 27th, he planned to do something terrible. The surveillance cameras of neighboring houses did not record the moment when 35-year-old James Colley penetrated the grounds of his ex-wife's house. However, this is not surprising, because he had lived here for many years and was well aware of the location of the blind spots, places that remain out of the camera's view. Obviously, the criminal reached the house through the backyard, remaining unnoticed. Finding himself inside around 3 in the morning, he found no one there and, in a rage, began smashing everything around, in particular, throwing things and dumping garbage from the bins. James broke the TV and several expensive household appliances as if trying to inflict maximum damage on his ex-wife. During the rampage, he was looking for evidence of her infidelity, any clue that would indicate Amanda's relationship with another man. Eventually, he managed to come across something that only confirmed his suspicions and ignited his furious rage. Around 4 in the morning, he went to his friend Mike, who lived a house away. Loudly banging on the door and shouting wildly, James was yelling something about Amanda, barely containing his anger. Then he showed his friend what he had found, several toys that he had not seen his ex-wife with before. James took these items with him, which were later found at his sister's house, from where he had presumably taken the weapon before the attack. Mike knew that at the beginning of the month, James had been issued a restraining order prohibiting him from approaching his ex-wife's house. However, he had already violated this prohibition, and now he had only aggravated his situation by breaking into the dwelling and stealing items from there. Such actions could lead to a court hearing and arrest. So his friend tried to calm James down, treating him to a couple of bottles of beer and advising him to go home and sleep it off, and not to do any more foolish things. However, James did not heed the advice and went to court to settle issues related to the first violation of the restraining order. On the way, he called his father and told him about the rampage at his ex-wife's house. His father scolded his son, warning him against further reckless actions. After that conversation, James' whereabouts were unknown until the moment of the attack. As soon as he was detained on the road, James was arrested and charged with 2 counts of premeditated murder, 2 counts of attempted murder, burglary of a home, and stalking under aggravated circumstances, including violation of a court order. He did not admit his guilt, insisting on memory loss, and was imprisoned in the county jail pending trial. Now the prosecution had to prove that it was James who had attacked his ex-wife, her friends, and Lomar. There were no video recordings that would unequivocally confirm his guilt, but the prosecution had sufficient eyewitness testimony. Investigators worked diligently to reconstruct the suspect's route on the day of the attack. James left Mike's around 4:45, then was in court until 6 in the morning. After leaving there, he drove to the city, which was a 15-minute drive from the house where he had lived with Amanda, where his sister and father now resided. According to the investigation, the man had plenty of time to return to his ex-wife. It was assumed that he first went home to get weapons and ammunition, and then went to commit the crime. James could not provide an alibi for the time of the attack, which only heightened suspicion. The prosecutor believed that the cause of the attack was the photo of the half-naked Lomar taken by his friend Mike. Investigators carefully studied the text messages and calls on the suspect's phone, as well as the history on his computer. It turned out that immediately after James left his friend's house, around 5 in the morning, he began sending messages to Amanda and trying to call her. A minute before the first shot, 22 attempts to call his ex-wife were recorded. Amanda did not answer right away, only when she saw the condition of her house. In the conversation, the woman reproached James for the rampage and theft, begging him to leave her alone. Obviously, the heroine tried in every way to avoid contact with her ex-husband. She even promised not to mention this incident if only he would finally disappear from her life. However, James' defense was not going to give up and intended to refute the charges of intentional crimes. It turned out that 2 days before the attack, doctors had prescribed the suspect powerful anti-anxiety and medications. These were supposed to normalize his condition separately, but in combination, they could cause an unexpected reaction. On the eve of the crime, the effect was complicated by the fact that the man was drinking beer and then stronger alcohol. Returning home late on the evening of August 26, James took a sleeping pill. The medication worked, and he fell asleep but woke up just a few hours later. The defense suggested that the combination of could have caused uncontrollable behavior. However, James had plenty of time before the attack for the effect of the drug to wear off and for him to become aware of his actions again. Evidence in support of this version was the fact that the same morning James appeared in court, where his behavior did not arouse any suspicion or signs of inadequacy. In court, he had to perform some formalities and sign divorce-related documents. The man remained calm, but as soon as he left the court building, he immediately resumed his attempts to contact Amanda by phone and through messages. Before going to his ex-wife's house, James filled up the car. The prosecution regarded this as preparation for fleeing the state, as the man had taken care of a full tank in advance so as not to waste time later. Obviously, he had planned everything carefully. On the way, the suspect stopped by his home, where he presumably armed himself. During a search of his residence, a rifle, 2 pistols of different calibers, and a large number of rounds of ammunition were found. The items appeared to have been hastily gathered, as they were lying haphazardly. There, the police also found the medications mentioned by the defense. James' attorneys thoroughly prepared for the trial, inviting several independent experts in pharmacology and psychiatry. Their task was to prove to the jury that the combination of drugs taken by the defendant could have deprived him of the ability to think clearly and act consciously. According to the lawyers, this completely excluded the possibility of planning the crime in advance, and therefore, the attack was a spontaneous outburst of aggression that James did not control. The pharmacologist argued that the combination of medications taken by the accused could well have caused amnesia. So, in declaring his non-involvement in the attack, James could be sincere. This episode really did fall out of his memory. In addition, Mike, during interrogation, described in detail to the police the condition his friend was in that morning. James' behavior seemed strange, sometimes inadequate. Mike knew how painfully his friend was taking the news of Amanda's new relationship after their divorce. He could not understand why James would not let go of his ex-wife and start a new life. On the other hand, Mike himself, for some reason, sent his friend, who was obsessed with Amanda, a photo of her new lover, which only fueled the conflict. Now he regretted his reckless act. Investigators carefully studied the correspondence between the friends. It seemed that Mike was telling the truth. James had long had a grudge not only against his ex-wife but also against her friends. In particular, he was convinced that Amanda's best friend, Lindy, had turned her against him at one time, for which he openly hated Lindy. The prosecution paid special attention to one of James' last calls to his ex-wife. In the background of the conversation, sounds could be heard that resembled the clinking of weapons, as if he was gathering them before leaving. After carefully analyzing the recorded dialogue, the detectives concluded that the suspect's father was trying to stop his son, but to no avail. James' own sister, Rhonda, was supposed to be a key witness for the defense, as they had been living together on the eve of the tragedy. However, at the time of the attack, the woman was on vacation in Italy, from where she returned only 2 weeks later. Rhonda denied the prosecution's version that her brother had prepared for the massacre in advance. She insisted that the pistols found in his car were usually stored there and that it was she who carried them with her. So the defense saw this as proof of the spontaneity and unintentional nature of James' actions. However, the prosecutors believed that Rhonda was simply covering for her brother, with whom she had had an incredibly close relationship all her life. The prosecution pointed to inconsistencies in her testimony. The woman was confused about the calibers and could not accurately recall which pistols were in their car. This undermined the jurors' trust in her words. James faced the death penalty for what he had done. Most observers doubted that the court would impose such a sentence, as the last death sentence in this district had been handed down more than 7 years ago. However, it was impossible to completely rule out such a turn of events. The defense did not even try to prove their client's innocence, they only sought to mitigate the punishment. The only chance to save James' life was to reclassify the charges from first-degree murder to second-degree murder. Then he could count on at least life imprisonment without the right to early release. However, the prosecution rejected any negotiations on a plea bargain and was not going to back down. After all, the accused had taken the lives of 2 people, and 2 others had miraculously survived. In the prosecutor's view, this clearly deserved the highest measure of punishment. The lawyers, on the other hand, insisted that James had no intention of killing his ex-wife and her friends, but that something had happened in Amanda's house that had thrown him off balance. Perhaps an altercation broke out between the men, which escalated into a shooting. But Rachel and Lomar, who miraculously survived the attack, unanimously stated that the assault was completely sudden. James did not talk to anyone, and no one provoked him. The prosecution logically suggested that the criminal had not accidentally gone to his house and returned, but had done so in order to arm himself. The very presence of weapons and ammunition on him indicated the intentional nature of what he had done. The final clarity in this controversy was to be brought by James' last phone conversation with Amanda, which took place immediately before the attack. A recording of this conversation was played for the jury in the courtroom. The dialogue lasted 14 minutes. During this entire time, Amanda desperately tried to get rid of her ex-husband, bitterly crying into the phone, begging him to come to his senses, then intimidating him with a court order. The woman promised to go to the police if James did not stop stalking her. It was obvious that the unfortunate woman had long been suffering from his harassment, but the man did not care. After hearing the arguments of both sides, the jurors went to the deliberation room to determine the verdict. Within 2 hours, they unanimously found 38-year-old James Colley guilty on all 7 charges against him, including burglary. But the story did not end there. 2 weeks later, the jury reconvened to decide whether James deserved the death penalty. His lawyers had not lost hope and continued to fight for their client's life. They even invited new witnesses to support the version of unintentional killings. These witnesses turned out to be the aforementioned experts, a forensic psychiatrist and a pharmacologist who argued that the mix of medications James was taking could have side effects in the form of memory loss. According to the specialists, the defendant was in a state of parasomnia, so he could indeed not be aware of his actions and not remember them. The psychiatrist explained that a person in this state is able to move around, drive a car, and even act purposefully. However, in reality, all these actions occur unconsciously. In such cases, poor coordination of movements is possible, but if someone without the appropriate medical education observes the victim, they may not notice anything unusual. However, the prosecution refuted these assumptions by providing recordings from the surveillance cameras in the courthouse that James had visited that morning. Before going to his ex-wife's house, the suspect had interacted with many people, but no one had noticed any deviations in his behavior. James behaved absolutely calmly and adequately, did not give the impression of being inhibited or confused, which is typical for a state of parasomnia. The prosecutors once again managed to convince the jury that the defendant was a dangerous killer because of whom 4 children were left without mothers. The jurors unanimously voted for the death penalty. Then the third, final stage of the hearings took place. The court gave the defenders one last chance to provide evidence that would allow the sentence to be mitigated. At this hearing, James Colley spoke for himself for the first time. He called the events of that day a terrible coincidence, but it sounded extremely implausible. The lawyers also failed to provide any substantial evidence, so the court upheld the previous decision on the death penalty. Statistics show that, on average, those sentenced to the death penalty wait for its execution for more than 10 years. This is mostly due to the efforts of the defense to have the sentence commuted through appeals. Colley's lawyers have already filed several complaints, but so far to no avail. However, they do not lose hope for a positive decision. Currently, James Colley is still in prison awaiting a lethal injection. I look forward to hearing your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. Until next time, friends.